The morning my nephew showed up with a lawyer and a notary public, I was in the middle of making coffee. That detail sticks with me. I just ground the beans, the good stuff, the Colombian dark roast my late wife used to order, and I remember thinking how quiet the house felt. Then the doorbell rang, and everything changed. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much for this story, but who I am does. I'm 63 years old. Spent 31 years as an electrician, journeyman, then master. Then I ran my own contracting business out of central Ohio. Not glamorous. I drove a Ford F-250, wore boots with holes in the toes longer than I should have, and built everything I own with my hands and my time. When I retired 4 years ago, I had a paid-off house, a decent savings account, and a rental property 2 towns over that I'd bought in my 40s and renovated myself on weekends. Nothing extraordinary. Just a life built the slow, steady way. My sister's boy, my nephew, I'll call him Brendan, had always been the family's golden child. And I mean that in the way people say it when they're trying to be kind, but there's an edge underneath. Brendan went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, got his MBA, landed a job at a financial consulting firm in Columbus. He wore pressed slacks to family dinners. He had opinions about wine. He once corrected my pronunciation of a word at Thanksgiving, and then looked around the table like he expected applause. I didn't dislike him. I want to be fair here. He was my sister's son, and I'd watched him grow up, helped him move into his first apartment, slipped him cash when he was between jobs right after college. We weren't close in the way that really counts, but we were family. I thought that meant something to him, too. It should have been a warning sign when he started courting more often after my wife passed. Linda died 2.5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end, which sounds like a long time until you're living it and realize it's nothing at all. She was 59. We've been married 34 years. I won't go into all of it because some things don't belong in a story like this. They belong somewhere private, somewhere I keep for myself. But I'll say this. Losing her rearranged everything. The house felt different. The mornings felt different. I felt different. Brendan started coming around about 3 months after the funeral. Once a month at first, then twice. He'd bring coffee, ask how I was doing, help me carry things to the garage. I thought it was kindness. I thought grief had maybe softened something in him, made him see family differently. My sister said she was proud of him for looking after me. I told her she'd raised a good son. Looking back, I can see every moment differently now. Like watching a film the second time when you already know the ending and every small gesture means something it didn't before. He started asking questions about the rental property. Casually, over the kitchen table, the way you ask about the weather. What was I getting for rent these days? Had I thought about selling? Property values were wild right now. Had I checked what it might be worth? I answered honestly, the way you do when you trust someone. I told him the tenant was solid, paid on time for 6 years, and I wasn't looking to sell. Brendan nodded, sipped his coffee, moved on to other things. A few months later, he brought up my finances more directly. He framed it as concern, said he'd been thinking about me, about what would happen if I needed care down the road, about whether my assets were structured properly. He used that phrase, structured properly, the way his kind always does, making ordinary things sound technical and slightly beyond the grasp of regular people. He mentioned that he worked with estate planning all the time at the firm, that he'd seen situations where families ended up in probate nightmares, that he could help me set things up so there were no complications. I told him I already had a will. He said a will wasn't enough these days. I told him I'd think about it. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already noticed something odd 2 weeks earlier. I have a filing cabinet in the small bedroom I use as an office. Old habit. I keep physical copies of everything. Deeds, insurance policies, tax returns going back 15 years. My wife used to tease me about it, called me the paper hoarder. I was looking for an old receipt one afternoon, and I noticed the deed to the rental property wasn't sitting exactly where I always put it. Same folder, but shuffled back like it had been removed and replaced in a hurry. Brendan had been over twice in the past month. He was one of 3 people with a spare key to the house. I'd given keys to him, my neighbor, 2 doors down, and my daughter who lives in Pittsburgh. I didn't say a word about it to anyone. I just paid attention. I called my attorney that week. His name is not relevant here. What matters is that he'd handled Linda's estate for me, and I trusted him completely. We met at his office on a Tuesday. I laid out what I'd noticed. The moved deed. Brendan's increasing interest in my finances. The questions about property values. The offer to help structure my assets. My attorney listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Let me ask you something. Has he mentioned power of attorney at all?" He hadn't yet, but my attorney said he wouldn't be surprised if that was coming. We talked for 2 hours that day. By the time I left, I had a plan. Not a revenge plan. I want to be clear about that. More like a protection plan. Because I'm 63 years old, I live alone, and I have assets that a sharp and unscrupulous person might find worth pursuing. My attorney had seen it before, more than once. Usually it was a romantic partner or a caregiver, but family members weren't unheard of. People with MBAs and good haircuts were especially not unheard of. Over the next 6 weeks, we moved quietly. My attorney filed paperwork to establish an irrevocable trust. The rental property went into it. The house itself wasn't included. We had reasons for that, which I'll explain. But the rental income and the proceeds from any future sale of that property would be protected completely. The trust named my daughter as beneficiary and my attorney as co-trustee. I also updated my durable power of attorney, revoking the informal understanding I'd had with my sister and formally designating my daughter in her place. None of this required Brendan's knowledge or involvement. That was the point. I also called a locksmith. Quietly, one afternoon when I knew my sister and Brendan were both at work, I had the locks rekeyed. I gave new keys to my daughter and my neighbor. I told my neighbor I was just being cautious, that I'd had the locks sticking. She nodded and didn't ask questions, which is one of many reasons I've always appreciated her. The following Saturday, Brendan came over for what had become his usual visit. He seemed relaxed. We talked about the Browns. Same as always, both of us half-heartedly miserable about the same team the way Ohio men have been for generations. He drank 2 cups of coffee. Then, with the particular casualness of someone who has rehearsed the moment, he brought up power of attorney. He'd been researching, he said, talking to a colleague at the firm. He thought it might make sense, just as a precaution, just so someone responsible could step in if I ever had a health crisis. He had experience managing financial documents, he said. He could make sure things were handled correctly. He wasn't asking for anything, he said. He just cared about me. I looked at him across the kitchen table, the same table I'd sat at with his mother when she was 12, and scraped her knee on my parents' driveway. I thought about the moved deed. I thought about the questions. I thought about structured properly. I told him I appreciated it and that I'd talk to my attorney. He nodded, said that sounded smart, and then he made a small mistake. He said, "It might just be easier if I drafted something and you could take it to your guy to review. Save time." I said sure. That sounded fine. He didn't know my locks had been changed. He didn't know about the trust. He didn't know I'd already talked to my attorney at length. He thought he was further along than he was, and that confidence made him move faster than he should have. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, my doorbell rang. I was making coffee, good Colombian dark roast. I looked through the window before opening the door. Brendan was standing on my porch. With him was a man I didn't recognize carrying a briefcase and a woman I also didn't know holding a clipboard and a notarial seal. An attorney and a notary public, he'd brought them without calling first, without warning. The timing wasn't accidental. It was a Thursday, my daughter's busiest day, the day she always had early meetings, the day she'd be hardest to reach. I opened the door. Brendan smiled the way people smile when they believe they've already won. He introduced the man with the briefcase as a colleague, an estate attorney, he said, who had drafted a document that would give Brendan durable power of attorney over my financial and real property decisions. He said it was really just a formality. He said he'd also taken the liberty of having a separate document prepared that would list him as a co-owner of the rental property, which would simplify the management going forward. He slid both documents across the small table just inside my entryway, the one where Linda used to put her keys. He said, "All we need is your signature and the notary can certify it right now. Quick and easy." I looked at the documents. I looked at him. I looked at the notary, who was watching me with the carefully neutral expression of a professional who prefers not to know too much. I said, "You brought this without calling me first." He said he hadn't wanted to make it a big thing, said it was just paperwork. I said, "You do understand that a power of attorney I signed today doesn't affect property that's already held in trust." The smile stayed on his face for a beat too long before something shifted in his eyes. I said, "And you understand that my attorney is a mandatory reporter for elder financial abuse in the state of Ohio, and that he filed a preliminary report with the county the morning after our first meeting 6 weeks ago." The notary stopped writing something on her clipboard. I said, "You should also know that I had the locks rekeyed in October. I have a motion-activated camera on the file cabinet in the back office. Picked it up at Home Depot for $42. It records to the cloud, so I have footage from sometime in September showing someone in that room handling the deed to the rental property." Brendan's colleague with the briefcase took a quiet step back. "I'm not a dramatic person. Linda always said I expressed emotions like a man trying to fold a fitted sheet. Technically functional, but not exactly elegant. So I want to be accurate about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and sadder and more complicated. This was my sister's son. I had driven him to his first job interview in a car I'd lent him for 6 weeks while his was in the shop. I had danced at my sister's kitchen table at his college graduation party. But I also thought about Linda's things. About the deed. About the months of careful, calculated warmth that had nothing behind it but arithmetic. I told Brendan he needed to leave my house. I told him his colleague and the notary were welcome to leave first if they preferred. The notary left first. The colleague followed without a word. Brendan stood in my entryway for a moment, and I could see him recalculating, deciding whether to argue or apologize or something else entirely. He chose anger. That surprised me a little, though maybe it shouldn't have. He said I was paranoid. Said he'd been trying to help me. Said I'd always looked down on him, that the whole family knew I thought I was better than everyone because I built my own business. He said some things that I won't repeat here, not because they hurt exactly, but because they were small, and I don't want to give them more space than they deserve. I said, "You need to leave now." He left. I called my attorney that same afternoon. He said the preliminary report we'd filed gave us standing to escalate if we chose to, and that the footage from the camera combined with the documents Brendan had tried to have me sign would be more than enough for a formal complaint. He walked me through the options. I asked him what he thought I should do. He said, "That's really up to you. Legally, you're protected. The question is what you want the outcome to be." I thought about that for a few days. I called my sister on a Sunday. This was the hardest part. Not the paperwork, not the locksmith, not standing at my own front door watching my nephew try to take from me what I'd spent 30 years building. The hardest part was calling my sister. She's 71. She lives alone in Dayton. She has a bad hip, and she calls me every other Sunday and we talk about nothing much, and it matters more than either of us ever says out loud. I told her what had happened. All of it. From the beginning. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to call you back." She called back 2 hours later. She'd confronted Brendan. He denied some of it at first, and then admitted enough. She told me she was sorry. She said it 3 times, and the 3rd time her voice broke, and I told her it wasn't her fault and I meant it. People make their own choices. Brendan is in his late 30s. Nobody handed in those documents. Nobody told him to move that deed. We didn't file a formal criminal complaint. I want to be honest about why, partly because my sister asked me not to, and partly because the trust had protected everything that mattered, and partly because I'm 63 years old, and I don't have the energy or the appetite to watch a courtroom proceeding stretch out over 2 or 3 years. My attorney sent a formal letter to Brendan and his colleague at the firm documenting everything and making clear that any further contact or attempt to access my property or finances would result in immediate escalation. The colleague at the firm, from what I understand, quietly distanced himself from the situation. I don't know what happened internally at that office. I don't particularly care. What I do care about is this. My daughter drove in from Pittsburgh that weekend. She didn't have to. I hadn't asked her to come, but she showed up on my doorstep on a Friday evening with a bag of groceries, and she made dinner in my kitchen while I sat at the table and drank a beer and talked. Not about Brendan. About other things. About her kids, my grandkids. About the summer plans she was making. About whether I'd thought about finally replacing the deck boards which had been soft in 2 spots for 3 years. I hadn't. I told her I'd been meaning to get to it. She said, "I'll come back in April. We'll do it together." I thought about Linda then. About how she would have handled all of this. She was sharper than me about people. Better at reading what was underneath what people said. She would have seen Brendan coming a year earlier. Would have made some quiet comment at a family dinner that nobody would fully understand until later. I'd always relied on her instincts more than I realized, and learning to trust my own after she was gone had been its own kind of slow education. But here's the thing. I had trusted my instincts. That moved deed. That small wrong detail, I hadn't dismissed it. I hadn't told myself I was being paranoid or ungrateful or unfair to a young man who was just trying to help. I'd paid attention, and then I'd done the work, and the work had held. The rental property is still in the trust. My tenant is still there, still pays on time every month. The house is still mine. My Colombian dark roast still tastes good in the morning. Brendan and I haven't spoken since that Thursday. I don't know if we ever will. I keep the door open in the sense that I haven't closed it formally. I just don't call, and he doesn't either. And for now, that's where it rests. My sister and I still talk every other Sunday. Her hip is giving her more trouble, and we've been talking about whether she should consider moving somewhere smaller, somewhere with less maintenance. We talk around the thing that happened the way families sometimes do. Skating the edge of it without going over, because what would be gained by going over it again and again? We're in our 60s and 70s. We don't have endless Sundays left. I tell her I love her at the end of every call. She always sounds a little surprised, even now, even after all this time. Like she keeps forgetting I'm the kind of person who says it out loud. Linda used to tell me I needed to say it more. She was right, as usual. I'm working on it, slowly, steadily, the way I've always done everything. That's how you build something worth keeping. I keep thinking about that $42 camera. The one I picked up at Home Depot on a Tuesday afternoon, almost as an afterthought, and stuck in the corner of the back office where I keep my files. $42. Brendan had an MBA from Ohio State, and a colleague with a briefcase and a notary with a seal, and the thing that stopped all of it cost less than a tank of gas. I don't say that to be clever. I say it because I think about what it means, that preparation doesn't have to be expensive or complicated. It just has to be honest. You have to be willing to look at a situation clearly, without talking yourself out of what you're seeing. That's harder than it sounds, especially when the person you're looking at is someone you've known since they were a kid scraping their knees on the driveway. What Brendan did had a logic to it that I understand, even if I can't excuse it. He looked at a man in his 60s, recently widowed, living alone, and he ran the numbers. He thought grief made people soft. He thought a blue-collar background meant I wouldn't know how to protect myself legally. He thought the word structured properly would land with the right amount of authority. Every calculation he made was based on who he assumed I was, and every one of them was wrong. That's what happens when you let greed do your thinking. It makes you lazy. It makes you underestimate people. Brendan saw the surface of my life, the work boots, the filing cabinet, the Ford in the driveway, and decided that was the whole picture. He didn't consider that 31 years of running a business means you've dealt with contracts and lawyers and people who don't always mean what they say. He didn't consider that a man who builds things with his hands also knows how to pay attention to small details, like a deed that's been moved a quarter-inch from where he left it. Linda would have said something sharp and accurate here about the difference between education and wisdom. She was good at those distinctions. I'm still learning to make them as cleanly as she did. But I think the core of it is this: knowing things isn't the same as understanding people, and understanding people isn't the same as being decent to them. Brendan had the first. He was working on the second. He never really had the third. For my part, I don't think I did anything heroic. I noticed something wrong. I made a phone call. I sat in an attorney's office for 2 hours and listened carefully. I had my locks changed. None of that takes courage exactly. It takes the willingness to follow through on what you already know, to not talk yourself into comfort when the evidence says you shouldn't be comfortable. That willingness, the stubbornness to keep going after something even when it's easier to let it go. That's what Linda saw in me from the beginning, she said. It's what got me through 31 years of contracting, and through 8 months of sitting beside her in hospitals, and through the strange long quiet of learning to live alone. It's what got me through this too. My daughter is coming in April. We're going to replace the softboards in the deck. I already bought the lumber. Some things you just take care of, one board at a time.